Thank you so much for being here. This is Digital Citizenship and iPad Management for parents. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why we're here and who I am, and then we'll dive into the content. So the origin of this webinar is because we work with Archdiocese of Los Angeles schools, and the schools that we work with are part of a grant called the C3 program. So they receive T-Mobile data-enabled devices, iPads, at their school, and sometimes those devices get to come home. And we always get big requests from schools for parent education. And so this is actually our first parent session after we've been working with schools since 2016. So we're giving it a try to see how popular it is. And we have a survey at the end to have you let us know if you would like more sessions like this in the future. So my name is Amanda Taylor. I'm a former educator, middle school and high school teacher, an academic coach, and currently I am the program manager and a professional development trainer, part of this project. So I work with teachers and students across the Archdiocese and have been doing so since middle of 2018. I also am a parent. I have a 6th grader and a 5th grader who you can see here, and we are a highly digitized family. So this is definitely something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. My kids are very techie. My husband and I are both very techie. My son got a 3D printer for his birthday, so we live in the tech world, and even I don't know everything. So we're going to share best practices with y'all today, and hopefully you get something good out of this. So the first question I have for you is, tell me, what is your first memory using technology? And mine's going to be a little different because my age and my tech skills do not match. I'm a little bit more advanced than most people my age, but I would love to know in the chat, you can tell me, what was your first memory using technology? Lauren, I'm going to ask you, since you're my moderator. Lauren's my moderator, by the way. That's why she's here, to help monitor the chat and answer questions as well. Lauren, what's your first technology memory?
My first technology memory, I had this Winnie the Pooh computer game, and I don't know, I was in elementary school when we had it, and we had like this super old computer in the garage, and I would go out and play that. That's like my earliest memory of technology, was playing my Winnie the Pooh game.
Nice. How old were you?
Probably like 7. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else want to tell me your first technology memory?
If I say it, you guys will all have a good laugh.
I mean, I'm going to age myself with mine, so go for it.
In high school, which was in the 70s, I built a 5-tube radio, which I don't think they do that anymore. But as far as like a desktop, when I was in my late 20s, I got one of those Commodore desktop computers, which was like one of the initial desktop computers.
Yep. So I'm just a little bit younger than you. I was born in the 80s, so solid millennial, and we'll talk about those generations here in just a second. Most of the people that I grew up with experienced technology for the first time in elementary school. So Oregon Trail, maybe speak in typing. Most of us had some sort of computer lab access at the time we were in like 2nd or 3rd grade. My technology experience is a little bit younger than that. My grandfather worked in IT at USAA. And so he and my grandmother had their own like home office with computers back in the 80s. So we were around computers a lot earlier than I think most people were my age. And I actually learned my alphabet on the computer when I was 4 years old. My grandfather had gone to a conference and had one of those big old 5.5-inch floppy disks, or 5-inch floppy disk, and it had a really fun little 8-bit program on it. And that's how I learned my alphabet. But I always had a computer in my home growing up. I got my first laptop before I even graduated high school. So definitely, like I said, a very techie family, but that doesn't mean that I know everything, because I do not. So I'm sure you guys have heard this before, but I'm hoping that I can kind of bring it to like how technology affected these generations, not just the stereotypes that we hear. So baby boomers, your early concerns are going to be focused on widespread adoption of television and how that influenced society, especially young people, with lots of conversations about how many hours kids were sitting in front of the TV screen. And that was when there was, 3 channels and half of everything was in black and white, right? Depending on, who we have in the room at any given time. Some of our teachers are baby boomers. Some of our parents are still baby boomers, depending on how late they had kids. For me, it's my parents that are baby boomers. It really just depends on who's in the room, but technology came a lot later as far as the technology that we think of today. Technology that they grew up with, that was like the big thing at the time, was TVs, color television, etc. Gen X, they had an analog childhood. My husband is a Gen X, but they also grew up with access to personal computers, and they're probably the first generation to really use technology for work and leisure. Their major concerns were Y2K, computer viruses, getting online for the first time, having email addresses for the first time, and seeing the impact that video game violence could have on people. And they probably very vividly remember their first experience going online, like that was a big deal. Or they still remember the sound of dial-up. Same thing with millennials. We grew up with the rise of internet, depending on which side of the millennial section you're on. I remember using dial-up. I remember having an email that only connected and then came back off. I didn't actually have access to high-speed Wi-Fi unless I was at school or until I went to college for the first time, because we kind of lived in the country. Even in college, I didn't have decent Wi-Fi at home because I lived in the middle of nowhere. So I only had high-speed access if I was at school. We also were the first youth to have access to cell phones. So we were getting cell phones around the same time as our parents. So we were learning together like how this worked. And I remember somebody telling me about texting, and I was like, who would text? Like, that's such a slow way of communicating with people. And now that's all people do is text. Like, I would so much have rather talk to somebody on the phone than send an SMS. But now that's pretty much all we do. We also are seeing the impact of social media on mental health. Social media was invented by a millennial, and we're also seeing the rise of fake news and misinformation and how rapidly that can spread, especially with social media. Our Gen Zs, and you remember most of your children, depending on how old your kids are, most of your kids are either going to be Gen Z or they might be Alpha, which is the next one. My kids are kind of right on the border. Technically, they're Gen Z. Gen Z, first generation to grow up entirely with technology. Maybe they didn't have access to it, but it was completely available to them. And we're seeing a lot of things about cyberbullying, online harassment, obviously still misinformation, propaganda, but we're really seeing the impact of social media and self-esteem and mental health, and kind of, because we remember having a childhood that was still, outside until the streetlights came on. These 97 to 2012 kids, that is not the world that they're growing up with. This is also post some of the stronger violence that we've seen in our country in the last 20 years. Things like Columbine, 9/11, all of those things have greatly impacted the way that we parent children versus the way that we were parented. And then, of course, the newest generation is our alphas. Our alphas are still on the younger side. Our oldest alpha is going to be 11. My son is technically considered a Gen Alpha, the one who wanted a 3D printer for his birthday. 3D printers, like the idea of having a video phone at 12 was like mind boggling. And my kid is literally making things out of heated plastic into toys upstairs. Like, it's just mind boggling what they're able to do. But what this next generation is going to deal with is not only the pushback on technology for all things, but also the increased need for technology for all things. AI is probably going to be the biggest thing that they remember. ChatGPT and the launching of that and the acceleration of that. Being able to not only do things online, but to access of things online. I don't think my kids have ever been to a video game store. They don't remember things like Blockbuster or Hollywood Video, where some of our Gen Zs may remember that from their early years. We actually start to see when technology isn't available to this generation as it being a negative thing more than them having it be a negative thing, which is going to be kind of a fun and scary thing. So, what are we missing? We're missing that nobody ever taught us how to use technology well and how to be a good digital citizen. We've started implementing these curriculum standards and things like that in schools, but it's still fairly new. And most of the teachers, myself included, as kind of middle of the road age-wise, we weren't taught how to use these things. And so we're trying to learn how to use it, but then also how to teach best practices to students, all while technology is still improving. One thing that we have learned, and one thing that we do see that we're going to talk about extensively here, is you have to make it about the do's and not the don'ts. It still follows the same rules of raising or having growing children around you. If you just tell them what they can't do all the time, they're going to feel like they can't do anything. So we have to talk about how we can do it and how to do it well. And kind of when my kids were little, when my daughter would throw things on the ground instead of putting it in the trash can, a therapist told me, instead of telling her don't throw things on the trash or don't throw trash on the ground because a 2-year-old doesn't understand, well, then what else am I supposed to do with it? I would say, trash goes in the trash can or trash goes to mommy. And then after repeating that phrase over and over and over again, one day in the car, she looked at me and said, "Mommy, trash," and handed me her trash instead of throwing it on the ground. And I was like, oh my gosh, it finally worked after weeks of me parroting the same thing over and over and over again. It works that way times 1,000, and it feels really silly to think about it that way. It's not safe to do X, Y, Z, and stating your expectations to children when they're like teenagers. But I promise it does work. It's about consistency. So I wanted to show this little clip really quick from I forget who this guy is, but we'll listen to this clip really quickly.
Taught in a negative way. Here's the list of things not to do on. Far too often, digital citizenship is taught in a negative way. Here's the list of things not to do online. And while I deeply appreciate the intent behind all the anti-cyberbullying campaigns, we don't teach other things as anti in our schools, right? I mean, we don't have like an anti-illiteracy campaign. We teach people to love to read, right? Digital citizenship shouldn't be a list of don'ts, but a list of do's. La Cañada School District in California decided instead of teaching anti-cyberbullying, they were going to start teaching their kids what it meant to be good cyber friends, which includes watching out for people who aren't being treated respectfully online. In addition to being more compelling, by the way, keeping it positive is actually something you can practice. You can't practice not doing something. The other thing we need to evolve is our thinking around recognizing that the skills required to thrive as a digital citizen go far beyond just online safety. It includes being respectful of people with differing viewpoints from our own, recognizing fact from fiction online, using technology to engage in civil action, knowing how to have the right balance of activities online and offline, and of course, knowing how to be safe and also create safe spaces for others. These aren't skills that students are learning, by the way, by watching adults either, you may have noticed. So we also have to do a better job ourselves. Last year in Chicago, we challenged you to commit to doing at least one thing different.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Watching the video reminded me, this is the president of ISTE. This is a big teachers educator conference. It's the Institute Technology Using Educators. And he talks about Dig Commit, and I'm going to share that and some of the other resources, including Common Sense Media, that we often share. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that he said was they're not learning this from watching adults or their parents. And that's something that we can do. And that was kind of one of the reasons we wanted to have this session is how can we as parents, we talk to the teachers about how they as teachers can help be better models and teach their students, but it also is a partnership. It has to come from home as well, which is one of the things that we really want to
Far
focus
too
on
often,
here.
digital citizenship is taught in a negative way.
There we go. So one of the things that we can do, and we're going to talk more about this as we go through the different topics, when you have a device in your home, whether it's a school device, whether it's a parent-given device, if you're a grandparent and it's a device that was given to the parents, whatever the case may be, you have to have expectations, boundaries, and consequences around those devices. We have 87 items connected to our Wi-Fi in my home right now. Not all of those are devices that we're actively using and touching like a phone or an iPad. But myself, I've got at least 5 devices that connect to the internet between phones and iPads and computers. My daughter has 3, my son has 4. And so each one of those devices comes with expectations, boundaries, and consequences. It can be something that is literally written out. It doesn't have to be something typed out like this from Common Sense Media, but I highly recommend that you and whoever is the adult in charge in your home go through what you expect and what you hope will happen, what those boundaries and what those consequences are. And if you need help, there are a lot of resources online, and I've got a couple of them listed here. This is just an example. And the contract that we encourage teachers to give to students in the classroom is very similar. We want expectations, boundaries, and consequences around those devices as well. So some examples of expectations that we have in our home is that you will only go to places on the internet that you are allowed to go. And we've talked to our children about what's allowed and what's not allowed. Now, we do have certain services that we use to help monitor that. But even with that, our children are still going to be able to get around things, given how savvy they are or how interested they are in breaking the rules. Once a boundary is broken or breached, then you have to have consequences enabled. And unfortunately, consequences can't be, you can never have your phone ever again until you're 18. We'll talk about more about why that's not okay. But one of the things that we have to remember is, and actually I think it's on the next slide. Here we go. Students are still lacking prefrontal cortex development, which is that center right here in the brain. And this is where impulse comes from. The inability to see ahead to the consequence of my action. So a child touching something that's hot, not knowing that that is going to cause pain later. Kids are still developing this. And so sometimes when they do something and you look at them and you think, why did you do that? And they're like, I don't know. They really don't know because they're still developing that prefrontal cortex. That's why repetition is important. That's why boundaries, expectations, talking about those expectations, reviewing those expectations often. That's why you see signs up everywhere at school to wash your hands regularly. What are the expectations of being in the hallway? What are the expectations of using the restroom, of being in the lunchroom? You have to have those same things at home. Adults are expected to have that memory a little bit longer, but with children, it's common that you have to repeat those expectations over and over and over and over again. And there's nothing wrong with that. So let me go back really quickly to this here. If you are interested, you can put in the chat, what are some current expectations that you already have established in your home? One of ours is on the weekend, we have mandatory offline time. So from 10 to noon and from 2 to 4 every day, the Wi-Fi cuts out for our children at home on the weekend during like school breaks, like spring break and summer. Mandatory 4 hours that they're not allowed to be online. And for some people, that's actually reverse, where they only allow so many hours of screen time. Our kids have access to the internet from 8 a.m. until 9 p.m. that they can use at their leisure, mainly because internet is also how we have access to TV shows and other things like that. But there's more than just consumption online. And so we actually have the restrictive time that helps us manage that. So does anybody have any expectations at home that you've already established that you'd like to share? All right. There are some additional parental control options out there. And unfortunately, people ask all the time, well, what's free? There's not a lot that's free. There's some free trial periods. There's some like really basic free things that you might be able to put in. The only thing that you're going to see that's free is stuff that's naturally built onto the phone itself. So for example, iOS has an app called Screen Time and has parental features that you can implement. But if you want something beyond what the device is able to provide for you, then you're going to have to look at these options here. My family personally uses Bark. I use it specifically for my daughter. My husband uses all the Microsoft controls on my son's PC, but we use Bark for our iPads and for the Apple devices that my daughter uses. Jen Kronk, who's been teaching some of our other sessions, really loves MSpy. That's what she uses for her two children that are similar to age to my kids. But nothing is going to replace that active involvement and communication with the children that you have in their home. If they have access to technology, then it's an unspoken agreement that they have to have constant communication. Just like if you were going to give your child access to a vehicle to drive, you would expect certain communication back and forth. Where are you going? When are you going to be home? It just feels a little bit different with a device because it's such a constant thing. But that it has to be there as well. So some of the other things that we're going to go through that we can do to best model these practices, as the gentleman said earlier, adults aren't always the best model, but we can be. And these are just some really easy ways. And these also mirror what we teach children and students at our schools, or what we encourage the teachers to cover as well. So privacy and security, news media literacy and media balance, relationships and well-being and communication, and then digital drama, which is probably the biggest hot topic that we hear about from parents. So your students' experience in today's world is not what your experience was. And it's really important to know that we can't just turn it off. Sometimes it's like, well, if we just didn't have devices, yeah, but you don't want to give up your calculator, and you probably don't want to give up your phone either. So we need to move with change and not resist it. So two books that we've heard of that we really like, especially for parents, is Behind Their Screens: What Teens Are Facing and What Adults Are Missing, and The New Childhood: How to Raise Kids and Thrive in a Connected World. Being online is a big part of social development these days. And of course, we're still learning about what that means and how that works. But it's important that we allow children to be a part of that, so they're not isolated from their friends. And there's a lot of benefits that we're getting from this, but obviously everything needs to be done in moderation and have safeguards in place. Common Sense Media is a fantastic resource for all things, not only for educators, but also for parents. So I've got, this is the parent screen here. There is a ton of stuff, and actually I think I have it up right here. So this is the parent page for Common Sense Media. If you go over here to parent tips and FAQs, you have tips for platform, topic, and age. So you can go through and take a look at that. You can also dive into the educator resources. There's the Digital Citizenship resources for family engagement. I believe that's where I got that digital agreement from. And then another one that I really think is interesting that I got from the DigCit commit link is the Tech Talk. This was actually produced by Mozilla, but it has a lot of really good information in here. So going through this whole thing, going through this yourself, and then possibly going through it with your children, I think is really important. It talks about what to do to keep your kids' data safe, how to talk about mental health with your students, bullying, FAQs, some other things that you go through down here, public Wi-Fi, lots of really, really great stuff. Things about passwords. If you have really not great passwords, that is probably one of the most important things I can tell you, that you need a secure password. And anytime you can, you need to turn on two-factor authentication. This is going to help prevent a lot of headache for you moving forward. And it's also a great thing that we can model for our own children. So all of those links are on this slide deck, and I'll have Lauren repost that again in the chat so you have access to it. So what do we need to understand first about students is that prefrontal cortex is still developing. The cause and effect signature in their brain is not fully developed. And for some children, it doesn't fully develop until their mid-20s. There's a reason why sometimes we look at children and we think, what are you thinking? They're not. And that's part of frontal lobe development. And sometimes it can take longer for boys to develop frontal lobe development than girls, but it affects all of us, and it can continue to affect us as we get older. But it's really important to know that sometimes it's not because they don't want to, it's because they can't, or because they are still learning how to behave or how to show good decision making. Privacy and security is a really big one. I'm not going to show this video, but basically it talks about like how to create a good password. And then Jimmy Kimmel actually walks people through like, okay, so how do you make a password? You know, I don't know, like, you know, like your first pet's name and then like the street that you grew up on. Like, oh, cool. So what's your first pet's name? And what street did you grow up on? And then they give him the answer. They basically tell him their passwords as their
cybersecurity today and how safe people
during the, you know, during this live broadcast. The one thing to remember is your passwords protect you. And the easier your password is, the faster and more often you're going to get hacked. There are lots of applications and things out there. Google will offer to remember passwords for you. Companies like LastPass will do the same. But there's a lot of things like anything that has money attached to it, banks, even the video game company that my husband works for, everything is two-factor, which means you have to have an authenticator app either on your phone or somewhere else that allows to have a double check. If you log into your bank and you get a text message and then you have to put in that code, that's an example of 2FA, which is two-factor authentication. You want to be able to turn those on whenever you can. Also, it's really important that you actually use the right age when your students are signing up for things. I know lots of kids that are on TikTok right now and they're under 13 or they're under 16. They shouldn't be on TikTok. They shouldn't be on social media. Why? Because the guidelines for those platforms aren't built for students those ages. While my kids have a lot of technology, they don't have their own personal phones yet, and they don't have social media. And that's something that we have actively worked to make sure that they don't have. And we know that they're interested in it, but that's just not something that we've given them access to yet. That's why you want to use their real birthday when you're setting things up. And if you do, for example, we set up Gmail accounts for our kids when they were really young, and we used incorrect birthdays years, because back then Google didn't have anything for kids under a certain age. And then as our kids were getting older and we allowed them to use it, my son did something and it triggered something in Google that made Google realize that he wasn't actually over the age of 12. And so he got an email that said, you know, we've determined that you're not the right age. This will be reverting to a child account. Please, you know, forward this to your parents. Otherwise, the whole account will be shut down within 10 days. So we had to like reset everything up. We had to put parental controls on it. And that's something that, you know, companies are on the hook for doing the right thing. So as parents, we also need to do the right thing. And if our kids are setting things up like this, we want them to be honest about their age, so they're protected in the way that the companies are by the government to protect them. Make sure that you're turning off all location settings when applicable. I keep location settings on for my daughter's Apple Watch and for her iPad because I use that for tracking purposes. But certain apps and things like that, I don't allow the apps to track her. The only person that should know the location of my daughter is me. You also want to limit discoverability, things like that. All of these things can feel really overwhelming. And that's why common sense media platforms like that will help walk you through it to double check and make sure that you're protecting yourself as well. One thing to remember is if the product is free, if the app is free, then you are the product. Your child is the product. So it's really important to think about that before your student or your child downloads every single app, you know, under the sun and is logging in and using accounts everywhere. The other thing, and this is new for me, using kids' profiles on smart speakers like Alexa and Google Mini, because speakers like that do capture and record voice. They use that to get smarter, but you can actually set up profiles that are specific to your kids. And so Google is required not to utilize data for children under a certain age. So having those profiles helps companies like Google do what they're supposed to do correctly, because we're not putting the wrong age in there. How many of you have heard of ChatGPT? If you haven't, I highly recommend looking it up, not because you necessarily want to be using it, although it is really cool, but because you need to know that it's out there. ChatGPT is a chatbot. It basically, it's everything that we wanted the little paperclip in Microsoft to be, like back in the late 90s. The little paperclip that popped up that told you, answered your questions for you, but never really did a very good job. ChatGPT does that. ChatGPT is basically the Google of our time, being able to type in a search and find exactly what you're looking for. ChatGPT will answer your questions. It'll develop content. The content it's producing is only as good as the prompt that you're asking it. But we asked ChatGPT to explain privacy and security online to a second grader, and this is the paragraph that it came up with. And then we asked it to explain it to an 8th grader. So you can see very similar, just a little bit more robust in the answers. Lots of steps to take to keep yourself safe and also in turn to keep your children safe at home. We're doing our best to keep them safe at school with certain internet filters by using productivity suites meant for schools and education, by using apps that are only approved and have following certain SIPA guidelines, but you get to do your part at home with home-based devices. One thing that we're missing on here is text scams. If your students have access to phones, you yourself have access to phones, you've probably experienced a text scam at some point. Sometimes these are phone calls, but oftentimes they're text messages. We actually made a video about this for some of the sisters in the Archdiocese community, just walking them through what is safe and what isn't. And one of the big things that we look at for text scams is urgency. If there's a sense of urgency to it, it's probably not real. If somebody is asking you for money through a text message or through Messenger specifically, probably not real. You always want to look at the link that they're sent. If they're sent you a link in a text, I would hesitate to open it. If it seems too good to be true, it probably is. Hey, you've just won $900. Click this link to get your money. Probably not real. And then also knowing what is see, how do I word this? What people are allowed to do. So while you may have text notifications that a bill is due, you're not going to get harassed by a company via text, typically about said bill. Another thing that we see a lot right now is IRS scams, where people will text you or call you and tell you, that you owe them money, that you need to give them Apple gift cards. That is also not true. Those things come by mail, registered, with confirmation receipt. So news media literacy and media balance is also really important. And something that we look at is the bias chart, and value and readability along with bias right or left. I think this is really interesting to be able to see. We get a lot of stuff that comes in our inbox or on our phones. And sometimes I wonder, like, is that true? Is it clickbait? I always look at the source of where it's coming from. Just because it's on the news doesn't mean that it's true, or that it's not skewed. Now, sometimes things, become news that maybe seem a little outlandish, but it's always important to double check and see. And there's actually a really cool website that's supposed to be nonpartisan that you can go. It's called the News Literacy Project. They've got a couple of different things that are there for you, but there's rumor guard, there's tools, tips, and quizzes to kind of see how news literate you are. But they've also got a really great podcast and different things to help you and your family figure out if something is true or not. We'll have these available for you guys to look through after. One thing that we don't talk about in here is algorithms and the time suck that some of these apps can be. So as addicted as our children can seem to technology, we as adults can get into that too. If you're on TikTok, if you're on Instagram, if you're on social media and you find yourself just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and you don't even really know what you're scrolling for anymore, we're looking for entertainment value, and social media is happy to give it to you. Remember, if you're not paying for it, you are the product. That's why so many of the free streaming platforms have advertisements now. If you pay enough money, all of the ads go away. But if you're getting it for free or getting it for a cheaper price, then they're still going to give you those ads. Certain platforms, YouTube does it a little bit, Instagram, Facebook, but TikTok is really kind of the master of the algorithm. Basically, it catches on to see who you are and what you like, and it kind of gives you almost like an echo chamber effect where it keeps on feeding you the same information over and over and over again. And at some point, it's really important to put it down and to step away. I noticed there's a game that I play on my phone to help pass the time. And I noticed that if I have a really hard level that I can't beat, if I put it down and walk away and I come back, the next time I play it, I'll beat that level. That's not a coincidence. The game is programmed to keep you there and to keep you trying. And if you fail enough times, you'll pay to pass the level. So they do that on purpose. And it's important to have awareness of that. This is a little bit about how the TikTok algorithm works. I'm going to skip this video for now, but I would highly recommend that you watch this and learn more about this, especially if you've got kids at home that are utilizing TikTok. Now, this isn't to say that TikTok's bad. I actually really love TikTok and I learn a ton of stuff. I think it's a really great application for finding like-minded people, for sharing information, for entertainment. All of those things can be really positive, but it can also be a really negative place if you're not in the right mindset.
That's not enough.
Relationships and well-being with communication. So how did you maintain relationships as a kid? I can tell you how I did it. We wrote notes to each other and we folded them in really fancy ways and we passed them to each other in the halls. And maybe, just maybe, we used one of these because this was the age that I grew up in. Getting my own personal phone line in my room when I was in middle school, high school. No, I was in high school. It was a big deal. I still remember that phone number, by the way. I felt really special. My mom got me my own phone, so I didn't have to share a phone line with my brother. because we were constantly fighting over who was going to get the phone. Back when your parents could eavesdrop on you and you maybe had an answering machine, it was a big deal, right? To have a cordless phone with an answering machine, and you would come home and that was part of your routine, was checking your messages. I actually had a landline and an answering machine probably all the way through college. I think after my husband and I got married in 2005, we had an answering machine maybe for the first year, and then realized that nobody called our home line anymore. And we moved and lost that phone again. That phone number didn't transfer with us. So by 2007, that's the last time I had an answering machine. One of the things that that we like to ask is, what is your longest snap streak? Lauren, do you use Snapchat? No. Okay.
Yeah, I was
So,
into it a little bit, but yeah, I never did this.
I was on a mission trip with a bunch of teachers. We were in Rwanda, and a teacher who was with us, who's a little bit younger than me, she's about 5, 6 years younger than me, was so anxious to get back to the house where we had Wi-Fi, so she could continue her snap streak with her sister. And so it was like this messaging back and forth. It's a status thing, and it's one of those things that while we may not understand it, your children do, and it is valuable to them. And it's just understanding why it's valuable. And there's a reason why, applications have stuff like this. The digital pacifier is the desire to appear digitally immersed. And it's strategic. As teens try to look busy rather than lost, awkward, or friendless, phones allow them to feel like they belong, even if they don't. And it's something that we see even really in young children. Have you ever been to a restaurant and all the kids that have iPads in front of them? No judgment here. We did it too. We did our best to engage our kids when they were little as much as we possibly could. But there were a few times where we just brought out that iPad because I wanted a dinner in peace and quiet. And the iPad was cheaper than hiring a babysitter at the time. But being aware of it, I think, is half the battle. Sometimes students do need to hide in plain sight. Sometimes adults need to hide in plain sight. I can't tell you how many times I have been at an event or at a social gathering as an introvert, and I use my phone as oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy, or I'm not available. Sometimes they may be seeking support, or they may be needing support, and sometimes it's just a way for them just to disengage for a minute, because it's hard to be on all the time. It's always funny to me when teachers complain about students hiding their phone behind a book or hiding their phone, behind their iPad. And it just makes me laugh because I did the same thing, but I did it with a book. I would hide the book I was reading behind the book that we were supposed to be using in class. So nothing new. It's just a different modality that we're hiding behind. Validation comes from likes. That's a big thing right now with social media, and friendships are maintained by commenting and likes. The first time a friend told me that she was devastated because her boyfriend changed his relationship status on MySpace, and I had no idea what that meant. It's even more so. And civil engagement is expected from students. Like, that's how you maintain being cool. We are very fortunate that our daughter's not there yet, but it's not far off. And eventually we will have to get her a phone so she can feel like she's part of the collective community. But we're holding off on that as long as physically possible because of things like this. And this is where I would really recommend reading behind their screens to get a kind of a full scope picture of what this looks like. We can't just turn it off. What we can do, however, is talk to our children about how it makes them feel. One thing that we notice is that our daughter doesn't want to do sleepovers. Like, by this age, like that was such a big thing. It was almost a status symbol of like being the person that people would come over and have a sleepover at your house. And there's a whole lot of reasons people don't have sleepovers these days. But the need to just turn off social media or not have it accessible. We talked to her. Do you want your friends to come over? And she's like, yeah, maybe. But it's hard to make it work, and everybody's really busy. And well, do you feel lonely? No, I don't feel lonely. Like I feel fine. And so talking to her about like if she's at home all the time and she's never hanging out with friends, does she feel like she's missing out? Nope, she feels fine. She feels like she's getting the social interaction she needs at school, and then she gets a little bit of it at home versus on the games that she plays, and it's fine. But as they get older, having these conversations with them, and if it is a source of anxiety, or if it's making them sad, or if they're feeling pressured, well, then you've got to start taking it to the next step and figuring out how do we make this and do this right? Because if you were talking to another adult about it, how would you handle that? If I was sad every single time I got off Facebook, well, then I would stop going on Facebook for a while. And I've done that before, where I've turned off certain apps from my phone for a certain period of time because it hasn't produced anything positive for me. There are certain people or companies or products that I stopped following because having that in my kind of atmosphere every day wasn't beneficial. The last one is digital drama, and this is probably the biggest one. And unfortunately, digital drama is not going anywhere anytime soon. Digital drama is present for adults. If you've ever been on Twitter and seen the Twitter storms that happen through different comments and things, and we know that digital footprint is a thing. Nothing ever really goes away on the internet. Sometimes we even call it the digital tattoo. Students are emotionally driven, and I would say that some adults are emotionally driven. And we have to teach emotional regulation online just like we do in person. And sometimes we have to take a little bit of our own medicine when we talk about this as well. And remember that they're watching us, and they're going to see what we do too. Students know what a digital footprint is, at least by the time they're in upper elementary school. They just don't care. Or they don't think about that in the moment. What they're thinking about instead is that somebody hurt their feeling or that they're mad at somebody. And if you've ever seen somebody blow up online or somebody get canceled online, you know what this looks like. We get emotional and we forget that there's another person on the other side of that screen or on the other side of that account, or that they're causing discourse and drama because of the views and the clicks that it brings them. I see this on TikTok all the time, or Instagram, where people will post controversial things or whatever so they can do activity, because even if you don't like them, if you comment on their stuff, I'm unfollowing you. You just added to their click count, which adds to their popularity. One thing to know is that cyberbullying is persistent, and it's super invasive, even more so than the type of bullying that we had. At least when I came home, the bullying stopped. The kids never got off the bus with me, and the bus was probably the worst place that I got bullied in school. But once I was home, I was home. Maybe somebody got your phone number and prank called you, but that didn't happen very often. Exclusion and canceling is also damaging as well, and it happens so much. And I hope that in the type of school system that we have with the Archdiocese, with the religious focus that we have on the schools, that this isn't happening as much, but it does still happen. And how do you know it's happening? How do you take control of it? Communication with students and teachers is a big one, and communication with your child. If you don't have those apps that are watching what they're doing or looking for those certain keywords, the only way you're going to get there is by having conversations with your students and figuring it out. And one of the biggest things that we notice is that students are afraid to come to us when things happen because they don't want to get in trouble too. So maybe they started it, but now they're in really deep. And so they have to feel safe coming to us, whoever it may be, when mistakes are made, so that so that they have a safe place to talk about what's happening. And it's important that we know that kids all make bad calls. You probably made a ton of mistakes too growing up as a teenager. We're just lucky that social media wasn't here to capture it. I think a lot about things like that. We grew up with lots of similar issues that our children are facing now. We just didn't have it blasted all over the internet. Another thing that you can do is if they do have social media, if they're old enough for that, that you restrict, you start restricted, you start with a smaller circle. Nobody under the age of 18 should have public profiles, period. They just shouldn't have it. There's nothing safe about that. But if you do feel like something is breaking the law or really getting out of hand, there is the Internet Crime Complaint Center. And I would reach out to the teachers and principals and admin in the area as well. I'm going to go back to device contracts and the apps that you can use to track and follow student devices or your children's devices online, because I think that's kind of it all starts there with a good, safe place and modeling appropriate behavior. One of the things that I tell people, that we tell students in the classroom is if they have iPads, there's an Apple on the back. And if I want their attention and we're in the middle of an activity, I'll ask them for apples up, which means I want their screens down, facing down. And so then I know that their eyes are on me. We do the same thing at home. We don't bring our cell phones to the dinner table. If we're out at a restaurant, we either keep our phones in our pockets or in a purse or a backpack. If it does have to be on the table, then it's always screen down. And it's just a sign of respect and engagement to what's physically present and not, what is happening, on our phone. Same thing in our cars and things like that. But that modeling good behavior is probably one of the best things that we can do to show our own children how to behave. But there's obviously much more than that. So any questions or thoughts that you may have, we've got a couple minutes for that. And thank you guys so much for being here.